Good morning, everybody. Sorry for the darkness and the warmth in the room. I'll see if we can get it turned down a little bit, but I don't want everybody falling asleep by 10 o'clock. Is this mic working okay? Yeah, okay, great. So my name is Gil Kirkpatrick. I'm the CTO at ViewDS Identity Solutions. And with me here is Darren Mar-Elia. And Darren's the head of product development at Semperis. And we'd like to welcome you to the Hybrid Identity Protection Conference Tech Day for Chicago. Thanks all for coming. I know it's hard to take time out of your schedules to just hang out and listen to technical lectures all day. We really appreciate you coming. This Tech Day is sort of an offshoot of a conference called the Hybrid Identity Protection Conference, which has been held twice now in New York. Were any of you here at that conference in New York? Nobody. So I would encourage you to see if you can attend in October. Is it coming up? Coming up in October. It's a two-day event with lots and lots of technical speakers, all focused on hybrid identity scenarios and hybrid identity technology. I imagine that the bags have some information about that. At the very least, you should check out the website, HIPConf19, and see if you can make it out there. So thank you again for coming. Darren, you want to add your 2 cents?
Sure. Just quickly, the goal of the HIP conference, as was the goal of the DEC conference that Gil started many years ago, is to really provide kind of a community feel to it in terms of sharing information, getting feedback from the audience. So I encourage everyone throughout the day to view it in that spirit. Talk to your presenters, get to meet the presenters during the breaks. If you have questions during the talks, this is definitely the kind of atmosphere where we want to encourage collaboration. So with that, I think I will declare HIPConf Chicago open for business. And I am actually the first speaker, so there we go. Okay. But thank you, Gil, for providing the inspiration and the support for the HIP conference. And we look forward to seeing everyone in the fall when we do our main HIP conference. We're still trying to solidify the location. I don't think it's going to be in New York again, but we'll see. Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm Darren Mar-Elia. I'm, as Gil said, I'm the head of product. Let me see if I can actually advance my slides. Head of product at Semperis. The little rodent up in the corner was just a joke of mine because I was tweeting on Twitter that I was giving a talk on securing Active Directory from voracious gerbils. So that was kind of the connection there. I've been around in this world for a while. I was a 14-time group policy MVP until Microsoft summarily nuked all of the group policy MVPs. But I'm still writing and speaking about group policy and related technologies. And if you've ever been to gpoguy.com, that's my website blog. So what am I going to talk about? What does the typical AD threat model look like? What are the ways that people attack AD? And then the title of the talk, the 7 tips for defending AD. So as I mentioned in my opening discussion, please feel free to ask questions along the way. It's just kind of meant to be a learning process for everyone, and I'm sure I'll learn stuff from you guys as well. So I look forward to having a nice interaction there. So what does it look like to develop a threat model? So a threat model is, trying to understand what the threats are and how they pertain to your business. So what are the threats related to Active Directory? How do you protect against each? And gives you, sort of starting that process gives you the ability to make good decisions about what to protect and how to protect it. And a key part of that, and this is something that I come across not only when I'm thinking about this topic, but also in my kind of day-to-day activities talking to customers, is what are the things that your organization relies on AD for? So certainly you have maybe some mission critical tier 1 applications that rely on AD. You may have infrastructure, other infrastructure that relies on AD. I mean, AD is really foundational for a lot of organizations. There's no question that if AD were to become completely unavailable, many of you would be running around, you know, with your hair on fire, and I'm sure 5 levels of management up would be equally running around with their hair on fire. So the point is understanding, you know, what are the critical things that need to be, you know, if AD is going to be recovered, what are the critical applications that depend on it? Where are the pieces that may have some dependency on AD that need to be addressed as you're recovering AD? So all of those, you know, whether it's, I mean everything, right? I mean, we log into VMware vCenter with AD credentials. We log into potentially Linux and Unix boxes with AD credentials. We log into potentially networking equipment with AD credentials, depending on the organization. So obviously AD is super fundamental, and so that makes its risk profile really high, and why threat modeling is a really good exercise to go through if you haven't already. Actually, good question. How many of you have done a threat model for your Active Directory infrastructure? A couple folks. Yeah, so you know, I mean, I think it's a really good exercise to go through, especially given that we're starting to see more sophistication when it comes to attackers going after Active Directory. Well, let me ask this question. How many of you would not consider your Active Directories mission critical? In other words, if your Active Directory went down, business would still function. How many of you fit into that category? Yep, good. That's what I figured. So you're in the right talk. So just kind of a sample threat model here. I just, you know, kind of took a few different modes of attack against Active Directory. Credential theft, getting to domain admin, golden ticket attacks, group policy objects tampered with, DC shadow attack, DC is encrypted by malware. All of these things are realistic in a typical environment. And so how do they relate to your environment in terms of risk, and what are some of the things that you need to do to protect against them or to fix them if they happen? So this is obviously just a small list, potentially, of all the things that you might face within your Active Directory environment and things that you have to think about. But they're worthwhile to put on paper as an exercise to sort of understand where the threats are coming from or may come from and what you're going to do about them when they hit. So, there, yeah, question.
What was the page I was about to write down?
Oh, yes, sorry. Forgot my own link. At the bottom there, I talk about the MITRE attack framework. So this is MITRE, if you're not familiar with them, they're sort of a nonprofit, quasi-governmental organization that does security-related research. And attack.mitre.org is a framework for building things like threat models and for understanding the threats for common platforms. So they have it's a compendium of lots and lots of threats and, you know, mitigations for those threats. It's a really great resource if you haven't gone out and looked at it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions on any of that before I move on? Any other questions? Okay. So I was talking about some of the classes of threats against AD. So credential theft is easily the most common, right? So this is what you hear about the most, is people getting credentials out of Active Directory and doing bad things with them. And those bad things vary widely, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Escalation of privileges. This is sort of goes kind of hand in hand with credential theft. We steal credentials to get escalated privileges. And once we get escalated privileges, we can do lots of fun things. Modification of AD objects. So again, I mean, these all sort of feed on each other, right? If I grab credentials that have the ability to make changes to AD objects, then I can do things like changing the permissions on an object, or maybe changing the permissions on the admin SD holder object, or adding people to a group. All kinds of things can be done to AD once I have sufficient privileges on AD. And as we'll talk about, AD is a big complex thing in most organizations with lots of cruft that's built up over the years. So I kind of, if I ask the question, can anyone tell me definitively, where all the delegation has been granted in their environment? I'm not saying, you're going to just spit it out right in front of me, but, do you have a really good feeling that where permissions have been delegated on all AD objects across the board? Most people can't say that because over the years of AD being in place, people have granted permissions to solve a moment in time problem, and that kind of builds up and builds up and builds up. And now you have this kind of legacy of weak delegation across the board, such that if someone were to get into the environment, well, it's a simple matter for them to grab credentials of somebody that has the wrong permissions on the wrong object, and as they say, Bob's your uncle. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about when I think about modification of AD objects. And then, of course, near and dear to my heart, modification of GPOs. I've blogged extensively about this recently, and there's been more activity, I would say, along the lines of what's going on with AD, where if an attacker can get access to GPO, a GPO is a very efficient malware delivery vehicle, right? So GPOs apply to lots of computers and lots of users. And if I can get edit access to a GPO that's linked at the domain level, I essentially have access to every user and computer to do whatever I want. And remember that group policy processes as local system when it's running on a box. Even user policy is processing as local system, and then it impersonates the user. So this is a very efficient attack vector if an attacker can get access to a GPO. And then another class of this is abuse of Kerberos. So you've heard of golden ticket. You've probably heard of Kerberosting. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But there's a variety of tactics for basically being able to abuse Kerberos credentials or Kerberos tickets to be able to get access to services where you would otherwise not be able to. So some typical paths of AD exploit. Overly permissive read access to critical privileged objects allows an attacker to understand your security posture. How many of you have heard of Bloodhound? Great, like half of you. So we actually had two of the authors of Bloodhound talking at our HIP conference last fall in New York. It's an incredibly powerful tool for sussing out paths to domain admin or paths to privileged access in your AD environment. And I would say 80% of what it does without a privileged user. It's basically just reading how your Active Directory is laid out, who has access to what, who has permissions on what. And all of that is the default state for most people's Active Directory. Most people the default is authenticated users have read access to pretty much everything in AD. And so what you're doing there is once you get an authenticated user with a foothold in the directory, they can basically read your entire security posture. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that it's easy to remove that because lots of things will break, but it is a point of fact that read access to Active Directory gives an attacker a lot of information about your security posture. Overly permissive write access on objects. So this is another area where Bloodhound and related tools will point out where there are overly permissive delegations on critical AD objects or AD objects that may lead to a path of escalation. So this is one that you can do something about because you should have a pretty tight idea of who should be able to write to, let's say, permissions on groups, members on groups, who has access to which attribute, who has write access to which attributes. That should be relatively easy to control if you go through the exercise. Now, if you're in an existing environment and you have, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of cruft that's built up, it may be a very painful exercise to go through, but it's super important to do it, and you can prioritize it based on those privileged objects that you need to protect first. But the point is, you probably need to go through that exercise at some point. Question? Was there a question? No. Okay. Yeah, question in the back.
So are you saying that we should remove or look into removing read access to Active Directory?
So the question was, am I saying that you should remove read access to Active Directory? I'll talk a little bit about that later, but it's not something you're going to do easily or lightly, right? Because it will break a lot of stuff. The approach that I've been taking is, let's find the important things, and you can use tools like Bloodhound in a defensive way. Show me where the paths to domain admin are. Let's look for those critical group objects, let's say. And do I really need to grant, for example, authenticated users read access on the members attribute of privileged groups? Well, probably not. We know that the members need access. We know that probably there's some applications that need that access. And maybe there are some administrators that need that read access. But I don't necessarily need to grant read access to everyone. And you know, part of I haven't kind of gotten into it, but let me just take a moment to talk about the typical flow of an attack. So the way this typically works is you've got Joe user out in your environment, downloads some malware that's running on their machine. Now the attacker has a foothold. They are an authenticated user in the domain because they're running as the user. Now if that user has local admin access on that box, which may often be the case, or even if they don't, it may be easy for the attacker to elevate to local admin or find another box where there's somebody with local admin. The point is, if I can get local admin on a machine, then I can use a tool like Mimikatz to scour the LSAS memory to find credentials that were left by other users that have logged in there. So what is typical in an organization to find on a given workstation? You're going to find an administrator of some kind that has logged into that box to perform some administration. If they've logged in, if their credentials are still there in LSAS memory, I can use Mimikatz to grab the NTLM hash, and now I can go anywhere that administrative user can go. And I can move around the environment, find other machines with other NTLM hashes in LSAS memory on them, and that's how I can make my way up to potentially get to domain admin. Now, in order to do that efficiently, obviously the attacker is always thinking about, how do I avoid getting detected? So in order to do that efficiently, you want to find from AD, what are the interesting groups and users that have privileged access? So what are how do I get to domain admins? Who has, ultimately I'd love to be on the domain controller, right? That's kind of the keys to the kingdom. If I'm on the domain controller, I can dump the DIT, crack everyone's hash, and again, the environment's mine. So what are the users and groups that I need to look for to be able to steal their credentials to eventually get up to where I can get on the DC? And how can I do that in a sort of in a stealthy way? So if I have read access to all those privileged groups, I can tell where their members are. The other thing I can do is I can look for, using standard APIs that Microsoft has had in the box for probably 25 years, I can look for who has sessions on boxes. In other words, who's logged onto a box. The best thing I can do is do it against a domain controller, because that'll tell me what workstation that user came from. But if I can do it on individual workstations or servers, I might get lucky and find somebody like a domain admin that's been logged into there. And if I can get access to that box as an admin, then I've got domain admin credentials. So again, there's a path to doing this and a process to doing this that's very methodical, but the tooling is all there. And so anything you can do to slow down the user from getting that information easily is going to make it more likely that they're going to get detected in some way. Or maybe won't get to their target at all, ideally. I don't know if that answers the question. It was kind of a long answer, but yeah. So I mentioned this earlier, but overly permissive write access on GPOs and referenced external paths that let attackers distribute malware. So, the idea here is that if I have write access to a GPO, I can inject any and all settings directly into that GPO. I don't have to go through GP Editor to do it. There's tools out there. I talk about some of them, but there's a tool set called PowerView that's part of the PowerSploit framework. And PowerView has new immediate GPO task. And what it does is it writes a new scheduled task, immediate task, into a GPO directly. So it just writes to the XML in sysvol. If you're not, if you're using some kind of auditing solution, you're never going to detect it unless you're looking for changes in sysvol. And then suddenly that user has just injected a new scheduled task that's going to run immediately on every machine that processes it. Question?
Even if you have AGPM?
AGPM doesn't, yeah, even if you have AGPM. AGPM isn't, in fact, it's less than useful because AGPM is really just it's just a change control thing, and it only sees changes that run through it. So
So if you do the change directly in the GPO,
if you do the change,
advances AGPM.
exactly. And if you're not using GP Editor, so if you make a change in GP Editor, it actually generates, at least it generates an AD security event log for the AD part of the GPO that changes. But if I'm just injecting a new scheduled task into sysvol, I never see that change.
But this means that the attacker's account needs to have write access.
They have to have write access, exactly. The attacker needs to have write access. But again, think about how you've delegated your GPOs. If you've done a good job, you have a very small set of people that have write access to GPOs. If you haven't done a good job, then it's all bets are off. I mean, the other point here is that, so remember that GPOs can be linked at the site domain and OU level. That means that anyone with write access on the GP link attribute at the site domain or OU level can connect a GPO that would otherwise not be connected to that container. So I wrote a blog post recently on my GPO guide post about how getting access to the domain NC head, the object that is at the domain root level, getting permissions on that can cause all kinds of interesting havoc. Not the least of which is that I can link a GPO at the domain level if I can write to the GP link attribute. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about external paths, but that's essentially related to this problem of group policy. And then, this notion that admins log in everywhere in the environment, right? So you're in the typical organization that doesn't have a red forest or doesn't have admin tiering, you might have domain admins logging into workstations all over the environment, servers, workstations, who knows? And all you're doing is you're leaving a trail of breadcrumbs where somebody comes in and reads LSAS memory and finds those credentials. And the more machines they find them on, the easier it is for them, or the quicker it is for them to get to a privileged access. So it's really important to think about where you let admins log in, and I'll talk more about that.
Question on that?
Yeah.
You mentioned the LSAS crack and mimikatz a couple of times. Does that apply when if you're logged in with a normal account on a workstation and you use remote desktop to connect to a server and you put in your admin credential, does the workstation store the admin credential for remote desktop?
Right, so the question is, does the workstation store the credential from remote desktop? I'm trying to remember, there's certain modes of remote desktop that you can use that will prevent that from happening. I can't remember what the switch is called. Maybe somebody else remembers. But there's a switch where you can connect and it won't leave credentials lying around. Joe, do you know?
I was waving it at John. I
Oh.
actually knew this like a couple weeks ago, but
Yeah.
my old age prevents me from ever remembering.
I can't remember. There is a way you can do that.
So it might or might not be safe to use remote
Yes.
desktop,
Yes.
depending on if you're
Exactly.
using it correctly.
Yes, exactly. There is a switch that specifically prevents credentials from getting littered. And if you look at the documentation for PAWS works, the PAWS workstations, they talk about using it in there. I should know this, but
Follow Miles up at Miles
Miles?
Sorry. Regarding which question?
So with remote desktop, not the switch that doesn't leave credentials lying around in LSAS memory.
Oh, if it's just disabling NTLM, that's a good question. I don't know.
Yep. Yeah.
It's in our new standard. It's there.
It is supported.
Yeah. You can totally do that.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's not safe to use remote desktop then?
No, remote desktop in its normal mode is not safe. No. And I'll talk more about admin tiering. And then, poor password practices like, having service accounts that are privileged that never expire and have weak passwords, things like that. I'll talk about Kerberos in a little bit, but really bad ideas to have poor password practices. Yeah, question?
Isn't a remote desktop encrypted anyway? You're talking about intercepting the remote desktop session?
No, not intercepting the session, but actually when you log in, the credentials are stored in LSAS memory.
So you mean going to the machine and
Yes.
actually looking at the device?
Looking at the credentials, yep. Yeah, so why don't I, just for fun, why don't I drop out of this for a second and I'm going to show you some fun with Mimikatz. This is, how many of you have heard of DC Shadow? Okay, a couple of you. So DC Shadow is a really fun new capability in Mimikatz. It's not that new anymore, but the idea behind DC Shadow is that once you've compromised a domain, again, the idea is to be able to do things in the environment without getting detected, right? So DC Shadow requires that you have compromised the domain such that you can replicate changes to and from the directory. So that's, by default, that's domain admins, but you could delegate that to somebody else. Question?
For the RDP and the W digest is the one that was forced to store the HLM hash.
I didn't hear that. Sorry, what?
The W digest.
W digest, yeah. Yeah, if,
Should be disabled.
so W digest, the comment was about disabling W digest. So W digest will leave passwords in clear text if it's enabled all over. But Mimikatz can still read the NTLM hash even if W digest is not enabled. So you don't want, the key is to not leave the hashes around. And if you remember, Microsoft came out with this thing called, now I'm not going to remember it. It's a mode in Windows where it essentially spins up a VM to store your LSAS secrets. And you can enable it, and that will prevent LSAS from sitting in clear text in memory. But it's only in Windows 10, I believe. Again, I can't remember what the name of it is. Credential Guard, thank you. Yeah. Clearly, I'm getting too old as well. Okay, so here's the scenario. So Mimikatz DC Shadow is, the whole purpose of it is I've got administrative access in the domain already. So I've already won, so to speak. But I want to start doing some more interesting stuff. I want to maybe elevate some other users so that I can use those users to stay persistent in the environment even if somebody takes out my main access. So how do I do that? Well, the key is I want to be able to make changes to Active Directory without you detecting them. So how do you typically detect changes in Active Directory? You go to the security event log on DCs, you look for 5136, 5137, 5141, whatever the event IDs are that you're looking for, and then you alert on it and potentially do something about it. Well, here's the cool thing about DC Shadow is you can inject changes into Active Directory without triggering an event in the event log on the DC. How does it do that? It spins up a fake domain controller. The only change you see on Active Directory is you'll see a new object show up in the config naming context under sites for that DC, but only momentarily while it's doing its injection. And then essentially it will make the change to Active Directory, push it to the directory, replicate it, and go away. And there won't be an event in the security event log to see that. So what I'm going to do is I have this user Claire Berg here. So Claire today, if I try to log on to the DC, this microphone action is really cramping my keyboarding. Hold on. So Claire is trying to log into a DC today. And when I try to log into this DC as Claire, you're going to get the message, sorry, she's not authorized for remote login because she's just a regular user. So if I go in and look at Claire's account, Claire is a member of domain users. Okay, no worries. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually grab Claire's DN. Not that. That. And I am going to take this wonderful command that I have here called LSA dump DC shadow, and I'm going to replace the DN that I have in here with Claire's DN. Okay, so now what is this doing? It's saying I want to operate on Claire, I want to modify her SID history attribute, and I want to add the SID of the enterprise admins group. Okay, here we go. So now we're waiting to inject Claire. Now if I time this right, let me see if I can time this right, I might actually temporarily see the DC add itself to sites and services, if I can do this quickly. So on this other window, I'm going to do a DC shadow push. And what I just did, let's see if I can catch it. I don't think I caught it. No. I mean, it was super fast. But what I just did is gave Claire enterprise admins through her SID history attribute. So now if I log in as Claire, stop. If all goes according to plan, Claire is now an enterprise admin. And the only way I would know it, if I go back over to here, let's see. So if I look at Claire again, obviously I'm not going to see any change to Claire because I'd have to look at the enterprise admins or at the SID history to know that Claire got anything different. She's not in domain admins or enterprise admins. If I go down to SID history, I'm going to see that enterprise admin SID there, but I wouldn't have known that otherwise. And if I go bring up the event log, oh, sorry. If I bring up the event viewer on that DC, hold on. Nope. And look at the security log. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to filter for 5136 events because those are AD change events. As soon as it actually paints, because we all know how high performing the security log is, or the event log in general. And I'm going to filter the current log on whenever it decides it's ready, 5136. And so what you're going to see is you're going to see the changes to the sites and services, in other words, the config naming context for this temporary DC that was added to the directory, but you will not see the change to Claire. So you will never see Claire's SID history change show up in here. So these are all related to that DC advertising itself as a DC, or that machine advertising itself as a DC temporarily. So the actual change, you will never know what changed, in other words. The only way you would know that is if you were monitoring replication within Active Directory and you could see the metadata show up for that particular object. Now, monitoring for DCs advertising themselves will give you an idea that something happened, so you can respond to it at least at that level, but you'll not know what happened. So this is kind of just to illustrate the power of the tools that are out there now. Now again, you know, in order to use DC Shadow, you need to have fully compromised Active Directory. But the point is there are other switches in Mimikatz that will let you do that, like getting Kerberos or getting NTLM hashes or generating a golden ticket if you compromise the Kerb TGT account. Okay, questions on that? Microsoft, you're so helpful. Okay, so some typical paths. Let's see, I did this one. Let me just get through that. So what are they after? Well, this is obviously, you never can predict the whims of an attacker, but typically it's for persistence to gain privileges and to ultimately steal data. But it also may be for destruction. I'm sure many of you read in the last year or two about WannaCry and NotPetya, and know that several large organizations, primarily in Europe but also around the United States, had their environments encrypted, including all of their Active Directory. I heard about one company in Europe that had all of their DCs encrypted in less than 2 hours, and this was like hundreds of DCs. And the only way they were able to recover is from an off-site tape backup that they happened to have, and it took them like 2.5, 3 weeks, and they lost like $30 million. So I suspect that's a small tip of the iceberg. We read about, in Wired, they had a great play-by-play of the takedown of Maersk. Maersk was another high-profile, the shipping company, malware, I think it was WannaCry or NotPetya, NotPetya, and it impacted their entire environment. Well, it impacted a lot of pieces of infrastructure. So this is a reality now that we have to deal with, and it's almost, well, I would say it depends on your perspective. I think it's almost worse than people getting in and stealing data because at least your business is still running. Okay, so what are they after in AD land? Certainly domain admins is the target, but it's not the only target. And this is something that I've been talking to folks about lately and seeing people talk about. You know, you always talk about getting domain admin when you're talking about these threat scenarios. But think about your own environments. Where is the critical data held? Where is the data that would cause harm to your organization? That's probably not necessarily in Active Directory itself. It probably is in applications who have other admins that have been delegated privileged access to those applications. So if you have a database that stores customer information, it's probably not the domain admins group that's granting that access. Now, obviously, if you get domain admins, well, you can get access to pretty much anything that anyone in Active Directory has access to, but you may be more likely to be detected that way because that's what IT shops are looking for. They're looking for people that are compromising domain admins. But you have to be equally wary about those application admins, those privileged admins in other areas that could mean an actual bigger target for a potential attacker. And treat them just the same way you treat domain admins. So I've already talked a little bit about some of the tools that people are using for this. Bloodhound is both a great red team pen testing tool as well as a blue team defensive tool. So if you are running blue team defensively, if you're running Bloodhound defensively, you can make a lot of progress in terms of shutting down those paths to domain admin. And I highly encourage, if you can get your management to sign off on running a pen testing tool in your environment, I highly encourage you to do so because it's super valuable information on reducing those attack paths. PowerView I mentioned earlier. This is a PowerShell module for interrogating and modifying AD. It doesn't rely on, AD users and computers being installed. Most of these red team tools are designed to be used without relying on particular Microsoft modules being there, right? Because you can never tell when they're going to be there or not. So they're sort of written from the ground up to look at AD, look at group policy, et cetera. Mimikatz, we've talked ad nauseum about that. And Grouper is a new one that I worked with a guy on the Bloodhound Slack forum to kind of enhance this one. So Grouper and Grouper 2 is a tool that interrogates your group policies and looks for interesting group policy configurations. And I'll talk more about that in my tips, which I haven't even gotten to yet. So let's get to the tips. Now, just to be clear, that the list of tools that I sent, that's probably like the tip of the iceberg, right? There's a ton of other tools and techniques for getting access to AD. Those are just kind of the more popular ones that I've seen. So tip number one, this is what I talked about earlier and what the gentleman in the back asked me about, which is hardening privileged AD groups. So the point is, do I really need to grant authenticated users read access to every privileged group? Probably not. So think about, obviously this is something you have to test, and take very slowly. But the point is, I think it's worth considering why share all that information to the entire AD universe if you don't really need to. Now, Microsoft doesn't make this easy, right? Because we never know what's going to break when we remove read access to AD. That's why I say test. And I hope everyone has an AD environment that mimics production somewhere where they can test. But if you don't, you can do sort of small steps towards this. Harden ACLs on privileged objects. So again, this is another one where you sort of may not be thinking about it, but let's say you have a help desk admins group. You don't want somebody to be able to make modifications to the help desk admins group itself to add users, so that the ACL on that group should be locked down, because help desk admins may have permissions on all kinds of AD objects, right? And so the other part of it is, if somebody were to compromise help desk admins, what groups and users do they have privileges on? Like, does it make sense to have the help desk admins have the ability to write changes to the domain admins group? Probably not. So you have to think about that when somebody is using a tool like Bloodhound or equivalent, they're looking for paths to get up to domain admins. And any path will do. Any user or group that has write permissions on a more elevated group or user is a path to move to the next level. And they'll move up that way just by being able to exploit your own delegation model. So think about, if you have help desk people, really they shouldn't be able to manage higher level credentials at all. You should have a system in place where Tier 1 manages Tier 1 stuff, and that might be all your end users. Tier 2 manages Tier 2 stuff. That might be all your server administrators. And I'm doing the tiering wrong if you're taking the Microsoft tiering model, because Tier 0 is domain controllers, Tier 1 is server admins, and Tier 2 is desktop admins. But let's assume that, don't cross the streams, in the words of Ghostbusters, right? So don't let people from lower tiers administer objects in higher tiers. And I'll talk more about tiering in one of my tips. So any questions on any of that? Okay. Hardened sensitive GPOs and GPO delegation. So GPOs that grant privileged access. Let's say you're using restricted groups, or user rights assignment, or security options, or GP preferences, local users and groups. All of those things are used to put groups into other groups or grant privileged user rights, right? So that in a typical organization, you may have group policies that are putting the help desk admins global group into the local administrators group on every desktop. Every GPO by default is world readable, right? So authenticated users is granted read access by default. There's no reason that authenticated users need to read a GPO that's applying to computers. And I'll talk about how to do this in a second, but I just try to make this point. GPOs provide a roadmap for how your security posture is laid out in your organization if you're using group policy to do that security configuration. So there's no reason that you need to grant authenticated users the ability to read those objects. And it's really only for GPOs that are granting security or controlling security. You don't need to do it on every GPO. But the ones that are controlling security, you want to control who can read them. There's actually a mode in Bloodhound called stealth mode. If you don't want Bloodhound to go out and do session enumeration on every workstation and server because that's more likely to be detected, then they can just hit the group policies and see where users have admin access and make an assumption that, okay, if users have admin access on those machines, then maybe those machines are good targets for me to go harvest credentials on. Question?
Are you talking about removing the authenticated users from the WMI filtering?
Not from WMI filtering. No, it's from the ACL on the GPO. I'll show you in a second. Yeah. The other part of this is control who can edit GPOs. We talked about this already. Attackers use those weak edit permissions to inject settings into group policies. And I talk about here external paths, which I just blogged about. Let me just kind of show that. It's probably easier to show it. So, not right now. Thank you very little. Let me see. That's not the machine I want. That's the machine I want. So, I have this GPO that sets some security policy. I just put a single security policy in here, but it could be, you know, restricted groups or whatever. It applies to computers, right? It doesn't apply to users, it applies to computers. But authenticated users can read and process this policy. No reason for it. So this GPO is in this engineering OU. I'm going to remove authenticated users. Yes, 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 thank you very much. And I'm going to re-add, in the simplest case, domain computers. Why is this different? Well, now I've taken the universe of people who can read this GPO from all user accounts to all computer accounts. Well, if I'm reading the GPO as a computer account, it means the computer has been compromised. I am admin on the computer. I am local system. So I've just taken the universe of things that can read this GPO from pretty much any user anywhere to a compromised computer in the domain. That's a big step forward. Not the only step, but it's a big step. The further step, if I can swing it from an administrative perspective, is to have it read and apply only for the computers in this OU, because those are the only computers that are going to use this GPO. And then, of course, admins, right? Admins need to be able to read it to manage it. But if I wanted to really lock it down, only the computers. I could create a security group, put all the computers in the engineering OU in the security group, and then do security filtering on that security group. So that's what I mean when I talk about, you know, locking down group policy from a processing perspective. And in fact, this change from authenticated users to domain computers, I wrote a whole article about how to do this and why to do it and all that. Question?
So if you authenticated as a computer or user, in this case a computer query for the GPOs. So if I run queries as system on the computer locally, I will still be able to get it, right?
You'll still be able to read it if you run it as local system,
So
right?
does an authenticated computer also apply to the authenticated users group?
Does the authenticated computer also apply to the authenticated? So computers are part of the authenticated users group, yes.
So if I use system every single time, I should be able to recall the GPO.
You will always be able to read it with local system. But it obviously implies that you have admin access on the box. Question?
What if you're doing item level targeting the preferences for, let's
Yep.
say, a built-in administrators group, and you're giving an application owner access to their own servers. So you have the group for the global group where the users are.
Right.
Then you also have a group for the servers.
Yep.
So you're doing the targeting on the group for the users and the group for the servers for computers. By you removing the authenticated users, are you affecting those users that will apply the item level targeting?
No. So item level targeting actually processes after the GPO has been already passed through delegation validation.
Okay.
So it doesn't affect, if I can read the GPO, then I can read the item level target. So it doesn't affect that. Good question. The other point I wanted to make is you can have GPO. So I might harden my GPOs just fine, but then you might have external references, external paths in a GPO. Like for example, here I've got a startup script that's on a different server. Well, if I have a startup script on a different server and that server is compromised, then an attacker can put anything in that startup script. And the GPO will happily process it even though he doesn't have write access to the GPO. So this is kind of an additional angle of attack that's now being kind of called out as an opportunity. That's what that grouper utility looks for, is some of these paths that might be in GPOs that do auto-execute stuff. So there's a bunch of them, right? So there's scheduled tasks, there's startup and logon scripts, there's a few others that I call out in my blog post. But the point is you can have external references in GPOs, and those need to be secured as well. You need to make sure that those aren't overly permissive. Because if I compromise one of those servers, then I can put anything in there. And group policy will just happily do what it's supposed to do. Okay. I think I'm close to running out of time, so let me just keep moving along. So I talked about GPOs. Admin tiering. How many of you have implemented admin tiering from the Microsoft white paper? I'm curious, how's it been for you? You're not finding it too onerous?
We're like sort of in the process, so we've carved out certain stuff, but it's not quite to the point that Microsoft would recommend.
Right.
But there seems to be a lot of schools of thought around this too.
Yep.
Especially when it comes to like red forest versus other designs.
Right. Yep. No, that's a great point that he brought up, which is there's different approaches to this, right? So I personally like admin tiering because I think it's a less painful potential mitigation to this problem of credential theft. There's other designs like red forest designs. Red forests are designed to take all of those privileged accounts and move them into a separate forest to get them out of being used in the forest under protection. Again, as was pointed out to me recently, you're not always just interested in domain admins and enterprise admins, right? You're always also interested in all these other privileged application users. And so if you can't pull those out as well, then Red Forest is going to solve some problems, but not all the problems. And if Red Forest causes you to more difficulties because of having multiple forests and having to cross forest boundaries and the tooling that you're using isn't working and all this sort of thing, then maybe it's worth it, maybe it's not. I think the point here is that there's probably not one perfect solution. There's a combination. It's that whole defense in depth thing, right? There's a combination of solutions that may fit your environment. But the purpose of admin tiering is to essentially not, if you remember that bullet point I had about littering admin credentials throughout your environment, it's this notion that workstation admins manage workstations, server admins manage servers, domain controller admins manage domain controllers, and they don't cross. I never liked this little yellow arrow. It's like, no, can't do it. Not allowed. But the point is, you're not leaving domain admin credentials on workstations and servers, because that domain admin account that you're using to manage domain controllers is just not permitted to log in to servers or workstations. And usually this is implemented with group policy, things like deny log on local, deny log on from the network, that sort of thing. And in fact, in the white paper, the Microsoft Pass the Hash white paper, they go through all the details of this. But again, did I ask this question? How many of you have implemented a Red Forest? Yeah, I did ask the question. Or no, I asked who had been implementing admin tiering. Who's implemented their Red Forest? No one's implemented the Red Forest here. I know there's a few
We're trying.
on the way too.
It's extreme administering and it's a pain in the ass.
Yep, yep. That's pain in the ass is what I've heard. But I know a lot of folks are using it. And I know that certain consulting services are pushing it.
Well, yeah.
Who shall remain nameless, because we're in their building. Pause is another. How many of you have implemented pause workstations? Privileged access workstations?
Process.
Yeah, so I mean, this is actually, it is hard, and it's not a bad kind of semi-step towards this. I mean, I think admin tiering and pause workstations can help a lot,
Yeah.
and password vaults. So,
Well, password vault is cool as long as it doesn't depend on AD.
right, yes, exactly. Password vaults that don't depend on AD. That's a really good point. Because if you get your AD compromised and then they compromise your password vault, forget it. I've seen some really creative attacks out there. I mean, I'm just like...
There's also the fact that if your AD's blown up, you can't get into your vault.
Exactly. Now that's in my day job, we deal with Active Directory disaster recovery. And you'd be surprised how many people forget how much is dependent on AD until their AD is completely gone. And like my backup and the recovery software uses AD. That's not going to help. So anyway, that's some things to think about for sure. Reduce the queryability of sessions and local admins. So this is not strictly related to AD, but it's a technique that Bloodhound uses to find out who's logged on where. It's using old APIs like the net session enum and the SAM APIs to go interrogate servers and workstations or DCs and find out who's logged on and from where they've logged on. Now I mentioned earlier that you can do this against a DC and get a ton of data because obviously everyone and their cousin is authenticating to DCs. The problem is that for a lot of security monitoring tools these days, that will trigger an alert if you try doing a net session enum against a DC. So it's not as effective for attackers if you have like ATA or one of those tools in the environment. So people then will go and look at workstations and servers individually, and that tends to be less monitored than a DC is. Now, I provide some scripts and policies here for turning this off. Again, you're going to have to test this because there may be some down-level, old, crappy software that you're using that's still relying on these APIs. But the point here is that you can turn this off. You can turn off the ability for machines to give up this information to authenticated users. And that's useful. Tip 6, Kerberosing. Kerberosing is this process of grabbing, finding accounts that have service principal names on them, that aren't enforcing higher levels of encryption, that may not have passwords expiring and therefore may be weak passwords. And then if you can crack the password, you can generate arbitrary Kerberos service tickets as this user. So it's a kind of another angle on Kerberos, attacking Kerberos, where I mine the directory for these so-called vulnerable accounts and then use those, if I can, to get access to other resources by basically hijacking those accounts. And so there's, the best thing you can do about this is make sure that you have strong passwords on any accounts that have SPNs configured on them and make sure that those accounts rotate frequently. There's this script that I mentioned that allows you to kind of interrogate your user accounts to see what accounts might be vulnerable. And then tip number 7 is kind of a obvious one, I guess, but monitoring AD is a start. As you saw with DC Shadow, monitoring AD may not actually help. But the point here is that focus in on what you really care about, because a lot of, I'm sure many of you have some kind of SIM in your environment, Splunk, QRadar, whatever. It's throwing you a ton of data, and how do you make sense of it? How do you get the useful stuff out of it? Know what you're interested in. I mean, we just went through this exercise of building a threat model. We should know what we care about. And those are the things that you really want to monitor for. So membership changes on privileged groups. You should be really cognizant of when that happens, because it shouldn't happen very often.
So, question.
Yeah.
So you said monitoring tools. So if you're monitoring like the SID history attributes, that should give you a clue that somebody manipulated something in SID history, right?
Only if it sends an event to the normal places, like the security event log,
Right.
which it didn't in the case of
But
DC
that
Shadow.
that was injected is the SID of the domain admins group, right?
Enterprise admins in that case, but yeah. Yep.
So maybe you can monitor the enterprise admin for changes?
Well, it wouldn't show up on the enterprise admins. Well, the only way it would show up is when that credential starts to get used in unusual ways. Like when I logged into the DC with Claire's account, that would be a tip-off.
But that split second that fake DC.
When the fake
added
DC, that
to
did
the
get,
admins,
yes.
That should be detected by monitoring tools.
That
like
should-
Request audit or whatever.
That would be detected by anything that looks at the security event log. But it won't tell you what was changed. It will only tell you that somebody injected a DC temporarily. So you
But
can,
it should give you like a clue.
it'll give you a clue.
Something wrong.
Exactly, right. And then the fun begins, because then you have to figure out what happened. So any ACL changes, ACL changes, I don't know, they shouldn't be happening all the time. I guess it depends on your environment, but ACL changes should be an interesting event from my perspective. Certainly ACL changes on sensitive objects like GPOs or admin SD holder, GPO changes. It's hard to, like I said, it's hard to detect illegitimate GPO changes if they're just injecting right into sysvol. You have to have like a file system notification method on sysvol. But that is something to be aware of. Unusual uses of Kerberos. So there are some artifacts that are common when you're doing things like golden ticket or silver ticket or Kerberosing that might be detected in the security event log. Sean Metcalf, who runs the AD security blog, has a great article about some of these events that you can look for. Don't forget AD integrated DNS. These are AD objects with all the rights and privileges of AD objects. And so if I can spoof a critical DC or critical server and send it in a different direction, that might be interesting to know if those changes are happening as well. And then monitor the configuration naming context for changes to AD sites, like I just mentioned. Exchange-related exploits. I have something more to say about Exchange in the next bonus tip, so I'll get right to that. Any questions before I move off of the monitoring one? Yeah.
So you can alter API DNS objects through LDAP.
Through LDAP, yes. How do you monitor it? Well, in most cases, those will still be logged in the security event log. So as long as you have SACLs on those objects, SACL meaning an auditing permission, those will be logged, even with LDAP. Most of the APIs will still generate. I mean, I know in the past, there were issues with certain like old school APIs not properly auditing events, but I think Microsoft has cleaned most of that up. And then finally, bonus tips 1 and 2, fix Exchange. Somebody said this once. Yeah, somebody said this once, that Exchange is a virus on AD. And I think it might have been even a Microsoft person, but maybe not. You guys, Gil or Joe, you guys probably remember who that was. I remember.
I spent work on Exchange.
Yeah. It's well known that Exchange puts lots of privileged objects in places they shouldn't be. And there are reams of data about taking advantage of those privileged objects to compromise AD.
And that's for on-prem mostly, right?
On-prem Exchange,
Yeah.
when you do the Exchange schema.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you, let's say you had on-prem Exchange and then you moved to Exchange Online.
You're probably still in a problem because you didn't get rid of those schema changes. So even if you're using Exchange in the cloud, if you had it before. So this blog, Fix the Exchange, is a great article on kind of going through some of that. And Microsoft apparently did some changes recently where they kind of fixed some of these permission issues with some of the Exchange objects. And then number 2 is physical security still matters. I just was reading this hilarious tweet stream about a guy that, a pen tester that basically walked into a branch office and walked a DC out under his arm. And it doesn't matter what kind of monitoring you have in place in that case, right? And then he just kind of went through the process of, you know, cracking the disk and then getting to the DIT and cracking the DIT. And it was like, yeah, this is, you know, we forget the obvious things, but, you know, if you have tons of branch offices, I mean, I think that's what RODCs were invented for, right? So do I really need my entire DIT read-write in the branch office? Probably not.
Well, and then people deploy the RDCs and still let it get all passwords.
Right, yeah, you still get secrets. But anyway, that's it. Any other final questions before I cede the stage? Yes?
On the monitoring, if you have an opinion or somebody else has an opinion about like using some of the Microsoft things like Azure ADP for monitoring AD correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I think others may have opinions on solutions like ATA and ATP. I think they work pretty well. They're, you know, it just depends on, I mean, the things I've heard the most about ATA is that it's hard to deploy because it requires span ports all over your network and it doesn't scale. So, you know, take it for what it's worth, but I think now they have ATP and it's supposedly better and it's doing all the analysis in the cloud. I mean, there's a lot to be said for kind of being able to do machine learning on that large amount of data and detect patterns that way, and I think that's what they're really good at. I think it's still, you know, you're still probably going to miss stuff, especially with some of these more sophisticated movements, but I think having something like that as a starting point is probably not a bad thing to think about. Yeah. Question?
Presentations from today, are you posting them at one location?
Yeah, what's the plan there, Ashley?
They're actually for sale for
Yeah, right. I'll have a little kiosk out front. I take credit cards.
All the videos are being recorded, and we'll have the presentations embedded in those, and they'll be up on our site within 2 weeks.
Yep. So yeah, I think that's the answer, is that the videos will be available. But here's my contact info if you want to, I think my email's on there. If you want to email me, I'll send you the deck too. Cool, thanks so much. Appreciate it.